Humans always strive for company, and other than other fellow humans, we were successful into turning other species into friends as well. And when we talk about friendship with animals, dogs stand out for their loyalty, devotion, and sense of self-sacrifice. Their emotional intelligence, accompanied by their intuitiveness, makes dogs communicate with us at levels no other animal species can achieve. Today's story is about a dog who had something to say to his owner, and when the owner finally figured it out, he was surprised beyond belief. But before we start, make sure to subscribe if you haven't, and hit that notification bell so you won't miss any new stories. George Miller is a single young man. The 29-year-old lived away from his family in a small apartment that he shared with no one. Looking for some company, George went to an animal shelter and adopted a little pooch with whom he bonded immediately. He described that as one of the best decisions he's ever made. The little pup that he named Crosby was the sweetest thing ever. The black and white pooch was so energetic, loyal, and couldn't be separated from his owner. Crosby loved going to the park where he could play with other animals. It didn't matter whether it was a dog, a cat, or even a squirrel. Crosby had an extraordinary ability to bond with other animals and form an instant friendship with them. And the hardest part of the day for him was when George had to convince the sad little puppy that it was time to go back home and say goodbye to his newly found friends. Even neighbors, as well as strangers, liked to stop George in the street and pat Crosby, who was always excited to meet new people. Yet, if there was anyone who would be termed the real friend of Crosby besides George, they would be a cat and a dog that belonged to the neighbor next door. Their friendship lasted for 8 years, and they would never get tired of playing together and getting up to mischief. Yet one day some very bad news was delivered to George and Crosby from the owner of Crosby's friends. It turned out that the dog passed away, and it wasn't long before the cat followed suit, leaving Crosby all alone and sad beyond belief. George did his best to help poor Crosby get over the loss of his two best friends, yet the sad look in the eyes of the pooch said it all. One day, as George came back from work, he opened the door and was surprised to not find Crosby waiting there to greet him. The young man immediately knew that something was wrong and started calling for Crosby. Yet the dog didn't respond as he usually would do. The young man got scared, fearing the worst, and immediately started walking from one room to the other looking for his pet. And to his surprise, he found Crosby in one of the rooms, sitting still and staring at the wall with unwavering attention. George walked towards Crosby and started patting him and asking his little pet what was wrong. Yet the dog didn't flinch, and that made George worry, as he wondered whether Crosby got his hearing damaged or was suffering from a mental disorder. George sat there stroking his dog until he snapped out of it and was his usual self again. And the young man sighed in relief as it was finally over, hoping that it was only an incident or the dog's attention was simply captivated by a bug that George didn't see. The following evening was a normal one, as the dog acted normal all the time. Yet in the middle of the night, George got thirsty and he walked to the kitchen for a glass of water. Yet he was surprised to find Crosby sitting in the dark, looking at the same spot that he was looking at earlier that day. The dog was so focused on one single spot and seemed so sad. At that moment, George got seriously worried and couldn't shake that image off his head, as he spent the rest of the night thinking about the strange behavior of his dog, and what was so special about that wall that captivated the attention of Crosby. Determined to find out what was the matter with his pet, George left his apartment early the following morning and drove to the nearest Walmart and grabbed a security camera with night vision. Then he installed the camera opposite the wall Crosby was staring at. Then he said goodbye to his pet and left for work. George left the camera there for a couple of days, and whenever he checked the footage, he noticed something strange. Crosby hanged around that wall when George was out, but the dog would only sit in that spot and stare at the wall in that way when George entered the room. George spent hours thinking about the reason for which his dog would do that. Was the dog trying to tell him something? Or Crosby was just trying to mess with his owner? After a while, George knew that the only way to find out is by taking action, and so he walked to the wall and started feeling around it, trying to detect anything strange about it. As he was doing so, Crosby started moving around him playfully and barking as if encouraging him to do something George couldn't understand. Crosby wasn't that excited since his two friends passed away. George noticed that and decided to examine the wall even more carefully. And when he placed his head against the wall, he heard something like a movement and froze in his place, wondering what might that be. George looked with his eyes wide, full of surprise, as Crosby was trying to tell him about that all along. As George passed his hand over the wall, a loose piece of wood paneling at the base of the wall fell over, revealing a fist-sized hole in the wall. The young man put an old glove on, then he took a deep breath, then carefully inserted his hand in the hole and started feeling around. With every movement, he could feel cold crumbs of plaster and isolation crumbling. and there was a thick layer of humid dirt at the base of the wall. As the small hole didn't allow him to inspect a large area, George widened the hole and tried to reach deeper in different directions as the sound coming from within the wall got a bit louder and clearer. And just as his arm was almost shoulder deep, his hand brushed against something small and soft. And at that moment, Crosby let out a high-pitched whine as if encouraging his owner to continue. It took him quite a lot of courage, but George reached for and grabbed it, and then carefully pulled it out to see what it was. George's heart dropped when he found out that it was a little kitten that mysteriously got into the paneling that separated the rooms, and Crosby couldn't be happier as he gingerly hopped around his owner, excitedly barking. George stood there looking at the dust-coated kitten, wondering how it got there. Yet what surprised George even more was the striking resemblance between the little kitten and Crosby's cat friend that passed away a few weeks earlier. George instantly suspected that it had to be Crosby who brought the cat into the house somehow, yet even if the pooch did so, how did the cat end up in the paneling was simply beyond George, who took the cat to the washing basin to clean it from all the dust that completely covered it. Well, Crosby was around him all the time, wagging his tail wildly, and looking so pleased with himself. The kitten was a few weeks old, and George hoped that he'd be able to find her owner, because the little animal apparently still needed the care of its mother, and the young man had no idea how to care for it. George went from door to door asking his neighbors if they knew the owner of the cat, but no one claimed it except for one neighbor who said that it was a stray kitten that he saw roaming in the neighborhood that week. Not knowing what to do, George took the kitten to the vet, who examined her, and besides being malnourished, the little kitten was in good condition. Then the vet scanned the kitten for a microchip, but she had none. At that moment, George told the vet that he was going to place the kitten in a local animal shelter, but the vet advised him against that, saying that the local shelter had hundreds of cats already, and no one seems interested in adopting them, and if the little cat ends up there, it would eventually be put to sleep. Though George never really wanted a cat, he couldn't take her to the shelter, knowing that she would eventually be killed, and so he decided to keep it until he could find a home for it. During the time the little cat spent at George's apartment, Crosby seemed so happy being the goofy, playful pooch that he used to be, as he enjoyed the company of the little cat and took care of it. Crosby even allowed the little cat to nest herself deep in its long fur to sleep, and didn't mind letting her use his body as a scratching post. All of that made George change his mind about the cat, and he decided that the family could be extended to include the little kitten that he named Ray Ray. That decision made Crosby the happiest dog in the universe, and Ray Ray was inseparable from the goofy, caring dog that she hung out with all day long anyway. The incident also taught George to pay closer attention to what Crosby was trying to say, as even a dog might have an important message for us sometimes. Another lesson from this story is that there are millions of animals locked in animal shelters all around the world, looking for a loving family before being put down. So consider adopting one of these loving and devoted friends.